Hello and welcome to this Play Better Chess video. So this is part 3 in the Improve Your Chess with Morphy series. So for those beginners out there that don't know who Paul Morphy is, he was considered maybe the first unofficial world chess champion back in the 1850s. He was an incredible player, the best in the world at that time, and his career was short. He only played for a few years and then he kind of gave up chess. So this is one of the last games that he played before he just kind of quit playing, kind of like Bobby Fischer. And there had been some comparisons between Paul Morphy and Bobby Fischer, who was another one of the greatest players of all time. So Paul Morphy has the white pieces here. This is an estimated rating of 2690, I guess, because Paul Morphy, in his time, I don't think they had ratings like this. He was just considered a chess master. And he played Samuel Bowden, who was considered a 2470 player. So this is in 1859, played in London, England. And so I'll do a quick game review here. Let's see if we can pull that up. All right. So Morphy played with 94.6% accuracy in this game. And we see he just kind of got a slight edge. And then it grew, and grew into the end when he won. His opponent had a 79.2% accuracy rating. So no brilliant or great moves. But it looks like Morphy played at a 2850 level versus 2250 by his opponent. But look here, no inaccuracies or mistakes by Morphy. His opponent had 2 inaccuracies and 2 mistakes. So let's take a look here. I'll turn on the computer analysis and let's see what Morphy did and what we can learn from his game. So I recommend you go over many Morphy games and help improve your chess by looking at those. So Morphy plays e4, which Bobby Fischer also considered best by test. He, I guess, looked at different openings and felt that e4 was the best move to go after an advantage. But d4, the other pawn in the center, or c4, there are other good openings. So his opponent responds with e5, keeping things equal in the center. And it's always important to fight for the center if you want to gain an advantage. Why is it important to do that? Well, if you control the center, it's easier for your pieces to pass through the center and prevent your opponents from doing so. And if you're able to get your pieces through the center, they can more easily go to anywhere else on the board that they need to go. All right, so knight to f3, immediately attacking this pawn, and Morphy's opponent protects that. So good moves here, bringing the knights out early because they're slower than your bishops, so usually you want to bring them out first. And the game continues with the Scotch game, which I just did a video on the Scotch game recently, which you can check out. It was the Scotch game versus the Scotch Gambit. So this is the Scotch game where you immediately bring this d4 pawn out in this position, or the pawn to d4, and help fight for the center. And why is this a good move other than attacking, adding more pressure to this pawn? Well, it opens up the board for your bishops to develop here. So if this pawn remained here on d2, it would block this bishop. If you only pushed it to d3, it could block your light squared bishop. And Morphy is known for trying to get his pieces developed quickly. So let's watch what happens here. The pawn is captured because generally, if you have an opponent with 2 pawns in the center, you want to be careful with that because they're controlling a lot of real estate with those pawns. And if you can knock one out, It kind of lessens their strength in the middle. Now here, the Scotch Gambit is played. Excuse me. The regular Scotch game would be to just capture here. But we'll see that Morphy, famous for just developing his pieces quickly, he declines to capture that pawn in the center because then he would have to move the knight twice in the opening. And usually it's not a good idea to move a piece twice in the opening unless you really have to. And why? Because if you're taking time to move a piece twice, well, that kind of takes away from developing another piece. So here, Morphy has two pieces. He's gone ahead in development. He's developed two pieces versus one by black. Now, of course, black does develop here his bishop. So, now it's even again. And what does Morphy do? Well, he goes ahead and castles. So his king is already safe. His rook is developed towards the center. And one thing you have to be careful of, if you gambit a pawn like this, you have to be careful that you don't just play passively after that, because if your opponent is able to hold this pawn, well, then he'll have an endgame advantage with an extra pawn. So you want to try and get your pieces developed as fast as possible, which is Morphy's plan here. So d6 is played. So Morphy, he has more space in the center with this e pawn versus this d pawn here, except for the factor of this pawn being in the center. So with that in the center, that kind of changes things, but it might be hard to hold that pawn there. And these pawns are doubled, which is kind of a weakness. So here goes Morphy attacking, inviting his opponent to take this pawn, and then he can develop the knight quickly. So what does Bowden do here? So Bowden, not wanting to go further behind in not wanting to go behind in development even more, he decides to develop a knight, but this is a mistake. So if we go back, after c3, black has an edge here, a slight edge, a quarter of a pawn's worth of material, and it looks like bishop to g4 would have been better to immediately pin the knight to the queen, but this move is played. Bowden probably thought, well, I need to hurry up and get my king castled to safety, and I'll develop this knight. But this is a mistake. So let's see why. Well, now the pawn is captured. So he has moved a pawn twice in the opening, but this is forcing his opponent to respond to this because the bishop is under attack. So we have two pieces defending the pawn and only two attacking. So this pawn can't be captured here. And it looks like if the pawn is captured, well, then Morphy would go up ahead +3. So it looks like bishop to b6 is really the best move here, dropping back. But now white has the edge. So Morphy pulls ahead. He continues developing the knight before his bishop, and a reason to develop those knights first, as I may have mentioned, is that it gives you more time to figure out where is best to place the bishop. Do you want to place it here to back up the central pawn? Do you want to pin the knight to the queen? So once again, bishop to g4 would have been the best move, but Morphy's opponent, wanting to get his king to safety, he goes ahead and castles. All right, now this allows another attack. So Morphy presses forward, moving a pawn again, which that is okay here because he's attacking a piece and his opponent will have to waste time moving that piece. Now he goes here, counterattacking one of Morphy's pieces. And this is a mistake. Apparently, knight to e5 would have been better, putting some pressure on this knight on f3. But, his opponent thought, well, I'll go after Morphy's bishop. What does Morphy do? He drops back, keeping the bishop pair, centralizing his bishop, aiming at the king side over here on h7, reinforcing this pawn, and the knight is left on the edge of the board. So not looking good for this knight. And now there's a threat of b4, pushing this pawn, and where does the knight go? The knight will end up being trapped, it looks like, because everything is covered here. He can't go here, he can't go there, of course, can't go here, and he can't go there because everything's covered. So continuing on, we have c5 being played. This move prevents that pawn from jumping to b4 and attacking the knight and trapping that knight. So what does Morphy do now? Well, he develops his bishop, pinning the knight to the queen. This is a good move, but the recommendation here is actually to play h3. The computer says that h3 would have been best, probably to prevent this bishop from pinning the knight to the queen, which the computer a few times has said that is better. All right, moving on. Immediately, the bishop is attacked, forcing this bishop to make a decision to retreat or attack the knight. So Morphy retreats, once again keeping his bishop pair, which can come in handy, especially if the position opens up more. And now we have finally this bishop to g4 move being played. But now it looks like c4 would have been a little bit better, driving this bishop back and attacking it. So we have a counterattack. Instead of worrying about this bishop, or worrying about the bishop attacking the knight, Morphy doesn't worry about that, because if the knight is taken, well, then the queen can recapture, and it would just help develop another piece. So the bishop is forced to make a decision. It too retreats, and it's interesting here, this kind of even kingside position, the symmetry of both knights and both bishops and the pawns, everything equal here on the king side. So now it's Morphy's move. So he attacks, driving the bishop back. So the bishop retreats, and Morphy develops the queen. So he develops another piece, going ahead in development. His rooks are connected now, giving them more room to move. Usually it's good to place your rooks on an open file. If there are no open files, like in this position, then you could look for a half open file, or put the rooks behind pawns that you plan to press forward with an attack in the future. So maybe rook to e1 with ideas of pushing this pawn in the future. Maybe grab the half open file on rook to c1. So what does Morphy's opponent do here? What does he do? He develops the rook to e8, moving that rook to the half open file, putting some pressure on this pawn. So Morphy likewise develops his rook. Now the computer says that this is the best move, bringing the rook from the queen side over and leaving this rook on f1. Now normally you probably would bring the rook from f to e1, but this rook is left here to help guard this pawn, which is kind of possibly being eyed by this bishop here in the future if this pawn decides to move. So maybe Morphy wanted to keep this king side a little more protected. All right, the bishop retreats back. Computer says this is an excellent move, but maybe a6 would have been better to limit the scope of this bishop here of Morphy's. So If we look at the position, this horrible knight is kind of stuck on the edge of the board, and that's probably why this bishop moved back. So this pawn can move, the knight can reroute back up to b7, and then try and get back into the game. So Morphy decides to press forward, attacking the bishop. That is ignored, and king to h7 is played, and this is an inaccuracy. So it would have been better, apparently, to move the bishop back to b6, keeping the bishop pair. So what does Morphy do? Well, first, he captures the knight over here, removing a defender of the king side. And then after a recapture, and this is why Morphy did this, because the queen was not able to develop and capture. Otherwise, the knight could knock out this bishop. So the queen is stuck with guard duty here and cannot recapture here. And so Morphy gives up his bishop pair, but he has wrecked the kingside pawns, creating weaknesses around his opponent's king. We have an isolated H pawn, doubled F pawns, and as the game progresses, these weaknesses can be taken advantage of. So Morphy knocks out his opponent's bishop pair, and now we have queen recapturing. The rooks are connected, but there's still this bad knight here, which is giving Morphy's opponent a problem. How does he get the knight back into the game? So Morphy picks the best move here, queen to c3. And this eyes the target of an unprotected pawn here on f6. Now, when you're playing chess and you're not sure what move to make, you can look for checks, captures, and threats. I've mentioned this in other videos. In that order, look for checks first because they're most forcing, and maybe a check would lead to a checkmate. Then you want to look for captures. Are there any pieces that are unprotected that you can just capture? And then threats, like this move here. So the queen is threatening this unprotected pawn, forcing the opponent to retreat back with the queen and protect. This is the best move. I guess another option could have been moving the king over, but then it would be in line with the queen if the king moved over here. All right, so Morphy presses forward, throwing this knight up here, getting it closer to his opponent's king, maybe deciding to attack the bishop. But if he captures that, it would help his opponent fix his pawn structure. So perhaps Morphy is really planning on jumping his knight here to this outpost. So how does the game continue? Well, finally, this pawn is able to push forward, allowing the knight to retreat back and get off the edge of the board. But this square is not very good either. So Morphy presses forward, launching a pawn storm against his opponent. And the king decides to step over here, helping protect this pawn, maybe relieving the queen of guard duty on that pawn. So knight captures. Interesting move by Morphy. This helps his opponent fix his pawns. Now, what would have been best here instead of capturing? It looks like e5 is what the computer recommends. But that would help undouble the pawns, kind of break things up in the center. But Morphy decides to go with this plan of getting rid of his knight that was on the edge of the board, knocking out a bishop, and then we have an endgame of knight versus bishop. And so if we look at this horrible knight, which is not doing much, versus this well-placed central bishop, that can be an endgame advantage for Morphy, especially with pawns on both sides of the board, where the bishop can quickly jump back and forth from from one side of the board to the other, and it takes a lot longer for a knight to do that. So the knight is captured here. The pawn, the deficiency of these pawns when they were all wrecked and doubled and isolated, that's been corrected now, and the pawns are a little stronger standing side by side here. So how does Morphy continue here? Well, he finds the best move, pressing forward with e5, giving his queen possibly some more line of fire or more scope to attack this king if we have a trade here in the middle. So that is ignored. So interesting choice by Morphy's opponent. He decides to develop this rook, which was doing nothing over there in the corner other than guarding a pawn, I guess. And now we have an interesting move by Morphy. The computer says this is excellent, but actually recommends e6, pushing the passed pawn, pushing this e pawn up to e6 where it becomes a strong protected passed pawn. But Morphy, what is he trying to do with this move? He drops his bishop back. Maybe the bishop was blocking the queen and he wants to slide his queen over, or maybe he wants to reposition the bishop. Let's find out. So Morphy's opponent decides to just move out of the line of fire of that queen, aiming up here. And Morphy does push the pawn forward now. And now this is the best move because he pushes the pawn, but he's also attacking the king. So Morphy's opponent has to, deal with this attack on his king, waste time moving the king, and that lets Morphy gain more time to continue with his plans. So back here to where the king was before, and now the queen creates a battery here, a bishop-queen battery, threatening to capture this pawn, deliver a check. How does Morphy deal with this? How does Morphy's opponent deal with this? He pushes forward, and then we have a pawn capture, the best move. And instead of capturing again and opening things up, the queen kind of jumps in here to help defend. So capture of the pawn, opening some lines up around the king. The queen does not capture. So there's an avoiding, Morphy's opponent avoids trading pieces off here, by capturing this. Then the queen could capture, but that wouldn't be possible anyway. So because the bishop is guarding. So his opponent grabs a pawn. Now let's take a look at material. It looks like Morphy is up by one pawn here. He's protected everything pretty good. So how does he continue here? Well, he just starts throwing his pawn majority here forward. The queen drops back to prevent this pawn from just moving any further. And now Morphy presses forward here, putting a passed pawn on the 7th rank. So instead of capturing there, because he didn't want to have to move his queen, if the rook captures, queen captures, well, then you have this danger of a fork here. The pawn would move forward, forking the king and the queen that would be here on this e7 square. So in order to avoid all of that, we have this position where the pawn counterattacks the queen. The queen drops over to the side, or slides over to the side, I should say, adding pressure to the king side. All right, so the game continues with this passed pawn, threatening to march forward here and trap the bishop. So what does Morphy do? He counterattacks the queen. The queen is forced to move, and this is the best square, but his opponent is completely losing at this point. So the final moves in the position are queen to f2 to help prevent this pawn from pushing forward, because now the queen is covering along with the bishop, and that rook is keeping an eye on this pawn, wanting to push it forward. So usually a good piece of strategy is when you have a passed pawn, or pawns in general, it's good to have rooks behind them to help them press forward. But Morphy kind of locks down this square here, preventing his opponent from pushing that pawn. So now we have queen capturing the pawn here. And this is an inaccuracy that results in a possible mate in 4. The best move would have been to knock the queen out. So if we go back and look at that, it looks like the best move would have been to capture. So if we have capture, the rook would recapture, and then what? Now the rook is preventing that passed pawn from pushing forward, but all these pawns are a big threat here. So what would be best? No matter what, it looks like there's multiple mates. They're mating 24 or 22. I doubt even, who knows? Maybe Morphy could have predicted those mates. But it looks like king to g8 might be the best move. But these pawns are just going to storm up the board like this. And now there's a threat of pushing forward, forking the king and the rook here. So it's looking grim for Morphy's opponent. And he probably cracked under the pressure. He decides to go after a pawn. And then Morphy's final move is f6 here. So this is where Morphy's opponent resigned. Now, why would he resign? Because there's a mate in 3 or a mate in 2. You can take a look at those and see if you can predict it or figure it out without looking at the answers here. Or I can just show it to you. So the best move would be king to h8. But that doesn't look so good because now we have g7 possible. The king is being checked. The bishop is preventing the king from escaping to h7. So the only option would be moving here. Then the fork comes here. Excuse me. The king's only move, though, is to capture. And then queen up here to f6 delivers a mate. So, possible ending to this game. But Morphy's opponent, he probably saw all that coming, after we had this move. And so he just resigns here. So interesting play by Morphy. And that was a Scotch game that turned into a Scotch Gambit variation, and it looks like it transposed into a Gyoko piano game. So that's interesting. Another area of chess you can learn from is when you're studying different openings, you might want to consider how one opening can transpose into another opening. And if you're not sure what I mean by transposing or transposition, that's just where one opening, you start out with one opening, and then through a series of moves, it transfers into a different opening. And that could be something you would want to try to throw your opponent out of the opening they're used to and into another opening that they're not as familiar with. All right, well, as always, feel free to leave any comments, like and support the channel, like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you if you haven't already. And also, have a great day. I will hopefully see you in future videos. So thank you and have a super chess day.